G'day, my name is Dee Michelle and I'm speaking to you from Adelaide, the capital city of South Australia. I was born in 1956. In January 1960 I was arrested and charged with being neglected, along with my 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I was then committed to a children's home where I stayed only briefly. I went into foster care in February 1960 with 1 sister and stayed in that one foster home for 15 years. Since 2001, I've been working as an academic at the University of Adelaide. I'm what I call a late blooming academic. I deferred university as an 18-year-old, went to uni when I was 21, but dropped out after 18 months, and was in my 40s before I finally got a degree. I now have 4 of them. I started my PhD and academic career when I was 46 years of age. Working in a university was not what I imagined doing as a kid, and why would I have, given that no one in my foster care family had gone to university or even finished school. I always wanted to be a teacher. I just didn't want to teach young children or teenagers, and I didn't know it was possible to teach adults. Thank you so much for listening to me today. Having an international gathering of care experienced people is a brilliant idea. And I'd really like to thank the steering group for their work in getting this organised, and Callum Lynch for his correspondence, his email chats with me. I'm sorry I can't be with you there in person in Scotland at this fabulous family gathering. So I thought I'd talk a bit about the history of foster care in South Australia, as it's strongly connected to Scotland, and in particular to a Scottish woman who migrated here from Melrose as a 14-year-old with her family in 1849. South Australia had only been up and running as a British colony for 13 years when Catherine Helen Spence arrived. I have a love-hate relationship with Catherine Helen Spence. I admire her enormously because she made a career out of writing when that was a really tough thing for women to do. She was a champion for female suffrage. She supported the education of girls when that was not popular, and she was the first woman in Australia to stand for political office. So all that is fabulous. However, there are ongoing problems with the foster care system in South Australia and more broadly in Australia that I trace back to the institutionalisation of foster care in the 1870s and Catherine Helen Spence's enthusiasm for particular practices. Not that it's all her own fault, of course. English migrant to Australia from Birmingham, Caroline Emily Clark, was an early spruiker of the system. And actually, Catherine Helen Spence claimed in 1909 that Caroline Clark got her inspiration from Scotland, but she also insisted, Caroline did, that the Australian model of boarding out, or as it was called then, or foster care, was actually an improvement on the Scottish one. During the 1860s, when she began her foster care campaign, Caroline Clark was rightly concerned about the children locked away in the state's destitute asylum. But the plan was to leave the parents interned and foster out the children. Many of the parents were the poorest migrants to the new colony, young orphan Irish girls, the lowest of the low. The lack of care for or about the parents of foster children in the late 19th century is echoed today. If there is a group more stigmatised, more marginalised, more silenced than those who've been in state care, it's their parents. So what are the other ongoing problems with 21st century foster care that I can trace back to the 19th century? First, the intention of fostering in the 1870s was permanent separation of children from what was called pauper or impoverished parents. There was an irrational fear of contagion, that pauperism or poverty would be passed on from these immoral parents to their children if children weren't kept apart from the parents. What I call systemic familial alienation, a systematic practice of separating children from parents and siblings from each other, was built into the foster care system from the start. From the 1940s here, there was a bit of a moderation of this practice because welfare authorities recognised finally the harm that was caused. But restrictions on access visits were common, and there were other insidious ways of alienating or attempting to alienate children from their families. For example, my foster mother had the power to control who came in and out of my life, and she exercised that with quite steely determination. Requests from my real father to see me were denied on the grounds my foster family were going on holiday. There weren't any alternative dates arranged. Eventually, my real father gave up and signed adoption papers, deciding I was happy where I was. No arrangements were ever made for me to keep in contact with my 3 brothers and older sister. My foster mother also reminded me regularly that my real mother did not love me, did not care about me, and I had to be grateful for all that my foster mother had done for me in the absence of my real mother. When I was in my 30s, the loss of a long-term relationship triggered the grief of losing my family 30 years previously. And this grief went on for years, for decades, periodic bouts of intense sobbing, wailing even, for all that I had lost as a child. Birth parents today are at least entitled to access visits, but these are often restrictive, sometimes limited to 1 hour per week or even half an hour per week. And I know of parents who do round trips of 4 to 6 hours a day travelling to see their children. But the attitude of that birth parents have a bad influence on children continues to linger on. Second, foster children were often separated from each other. Scattered and lost was the phrase that Helen Spence used. When I was growing up, I had no idea that my sister and I were not the only foster kids in South Australia. We're not the only kids who had to have forms signed by a guardian instead of a parent, and occasional visits from a social worker. This isolation from other foster children was compounded by the social isolation my foster mother enforced. Until I was in my late teens, I wasn't allowed to visit friends in their homes, nor were friends allowed to visit me. It took until 1993 for an organisation, now called Create, to be set up which connects kids with each other in out-of-home care, as we call looked after kids in Australia. And this was intentionally to reverse that scatter and lose mentality Catherine Helen Spence had been so proud of. Create is for young people up to the age of 25. In 2000, a clan was formed, and that is for older care leavers. Create challenges the current system to better provide for kids in state care, and Clan has been instrumental in advocating for very significant federal government inquiries into the historical abuse of children in state care. However, there is still an attitude of risk about young people in out-of-home care being in contact with each other, as if they will corrupt and encourage each other to engage in antisocial behaviour. This totally disregards the young people's need to be with others in similar situations, so that they can be validated and supported. Third, Catherine Helen Spence raved about what she called the flexibility in the system, by which she meant that if a child and foster family weren't suited to each other, the child could be moved. This seemed very well intentioned on the part of foster care advocates. They didn't want children stuck with adults they didn't like. But they didn't consider power relationships. Usually, it was foster parents who rejected children, whereas if children indicated their dissatisfaction, their unhappiness, that they were being abused, if they indicated that by running away, they were arrested and could be punished by being imprisoned in detention centres and reform schools. Legislation in 1903 made it legal for state children to be beaten, isolated for up to 48 hours and kept on a diet of bread and water. It wasn't until the 1970s that running away ceased to be an offence, but even today the police continue to be called on to locate children and young people missing from care and to help control some children. Oh, and it wasn't until the 1970s that children stopped being arrested, charged and committed because of the situations they were in. Given the history of criminalising children, the history of arresting, charging and committing children for being neglected or for who their parents are, it's not surprising that many care leavers talk about the pain of feeling stigmatised. This was common in the 19th century, the 20th and now in the 21st. Importantly, the idea of flexibility also means that some children and young people have multiple placements. For a research project, I interviewed one woman who's now in her 60s. She had been moved back and forth between foster care and residential care at least 60 times. I interviewed another care leaver now in her 30s, and she was moved around 49 times in 15 years. 2 years ago, in 2016, an inquiry into child protection in South Australia said multiple placements was a significant problem. According to the report, South Australia has an extraordinarily high rate of placement instability, with something like 13% of those leaving care in 2014 being moved more than 11 times. The report doesn't tell us the actual number of placements those young people had, but the number is likely to have been far higher than 11. I heard a story recently of a 16-year-old being moved 100 times. Fourth, threatening children with removal from a foster home if they were disobedient or naughty was another practice enthusiastically endorsed by Catherine Spence, and is one that would also have contributed to placement instability. When I was about 8 or 9 years of age, my much older foster sister, colluding with my foster mother, drove me past a reform school for children, threatening this as a consequence for bad behaviour. The next step was to pack my bags and leave me waiting outside on the front wall for the social worker to come and collect me. My foster mother, my mum, never did carry out the threats, but the impact was traumatic. I never felt safe at home or with my mum, even though I loved her and was very loyal to her. This old trauma was triggered in recent years when I had a series of contracts at the University of Adelaide. Insecure work, not knowing if my contract would be renewed the following year, was like being a foster kid all over again. Fifth, Catherine Spence and Caroline Clark were keen for foster children to be educated. And that was a good thing, but they meant only to educate the children to the level of their so-called respectable working class peers. There was no expectation that children would be elevated any further above their status than that. Instead, the foster care system was set up to raise good working class kids who at the age of 13 went off to work as domestic servants and labourers for the middle and upper classes. A convenient arrangement, I think, for the middle classes. To her credit, my foster mother didn't boot me out when I was 15, the mandatory school leaving age in the 1970s. I was able to do the 2 extra years and matriculate or qualify for university. One of the advantages of a stable foster care placement, even if I didn't feel safe at home, was that I went to 1 primary school and 1 high school. Therefore, my education wasn't disrupted, as so often is the case for children and young people who go through multiple placements. I have only happy memories of school. It was a sanctuary for me, a haven. I had friends. Teachers were kind and encouraging, and consequently I did well. When I was a teenager, there was lots of talks about university. It was in the air, so to speak, for most of my high school years. The new federal Labor government abolished university fees in 1974, the year I turned 18, and it was part of their election campaign for 2 years in 1972. We don't have free university education anymore, and as a nation we're lagging a long way behind the United Kingdom and the United States when it comes to care leavers going to university. We didn't even start having a conversation about this until 2012. Thanks to care leaver Jackie Wilson, who was an academic at Federation University in Victoria, and Andrew Harvey at La Trobe University, also in Victoria, there are now a handful of our 41 universities which do offer bursaries, scholarships and on-campus support for care leavers. Unfortunately, however, there is no national commitment to roll out this support across the country, and I can't see it getting on the national agenda anytime soon. After all, it's taken 10 years of advocacy for 3 out of our 6 states and 2 territories to commit to supporting young people in foster and kinship care by extending payments to carers until the young people turn 21. And that's only just happened this year. When I reflect back now, I realise there was a lot of love on the way through my childhood. My foster mum was harsh, but I did always have a home to go to, and there were members of her extended family who were kind. I had my one sister with me, and when I had to leave home at 18, my boss and his wife took me in and were fabulous in helping me find my own place. All along the way, I've encountered people who've offered guidance and advice, which I rarely took, being a bit stubborn, and also friendship. I couldn't always appreciate the kindness, nor see it as a manifestation of love, because I was so often overwhelmed, dominated by feelings of shame, sadness, and anger. But it was always there. I actually didn't understand how verbally and emotionally abusive my foster mother was until I was pregnant with my first child. I was 27 years old at the time. I hadn't planned on having children, but I was having that baby whether my partner was going to support me or not. And I'd go walking my dog in local parks and fantasize about the life I wanted to give my baby. I wanted to shower them with love and with intellectual stimulation. And gradually I realized as I walked that I wanted a very different life for my baby than what I'd had. Because I didn't know much about parenting, I read up as much as I could, and after my daughter was born, I suddenly appreciated the magnitude of taking care of someone other than myself, especially after I'd popped her into the car for the first time. 35 years ago, we didn't have the understanding in the broader community we do now about postnatal depression and how past trauma can be triggered by current events. Therefore, having a child was both wonderful and challenging. Feeling loved unconditionally for the first time in my life by my daughter gave me the confidence and courage to make changes. I took up more responsible positions at work, and I eventually left an unsupported, stifling relationship. Things were a bit rocky for a while, more so than was ideal for my daughter. Luckily, when she was 7, I met and married my husband, and that was good for the two of us. I was reading about parenting again after my second child was born, my son, 8 years after my daughter. I shot bolt upright at the conclusion of a book called My Mother, Myself by Nancy Friday, because she stresses the importance of being a role model for children, not living vicariously through them. In that moment, I decided I might as well get credit for all the reading I was doing and head back to university. Studying part-time and caring for my, eventually, 3 children, I went on to have another daughter, became my life over the next 10 years. And these were richly rewarding years as parenting my children, including making many mistakes I regret, provided me with the opportunity to reparent myself. And it was loving my children and being loved by them, as well as being loved and supported by my husband, that changed my life. My 3 children are all grown up and are university educated themselves, although my youngest has a year to go to finish her social work degree. To other care leavers who are thinking about having a family, I'd like you to think about taking the time to reflect on whether you have enough support to do this very important work. It is vitally important to me that we stop as a species, stop cycles of abuse by lavishing love on our children and caring for them appropriately. There's always the danger that if we don't face the hurt and suffering we've experienced, that we'll pass it on to others. To those care leavers there who would like to go to university but aren't sure you've got what it takes, know you are as capable as any other university student. It might take you a bit longer to learn how to navigate the system, and you might not have the support other students have, but you've survived some of the most difficult situations imaginable. If you can do that, you can do anything. Remember that you have as much right to be there as anyone else. Use every ounce of support that your university has available, and call on the International Care Experience family for support when you need it. Who would have thought that 169 years after Catherine Helen Spence arrived in Adelaide, I'd be connecting up with care experience people across the globe, and that it would be a Scottish organisation responsible for this. I hope we can keep on talking back to a system that has been brutal in its disregard of our voices and our lives for more than 150 years. Thank you.